Next, how can I introduce them though? So it's not meet a kid. Next we're going to show you a message from our young people, right?
From your youth advisory board?
Yeah. So in between each show, to end our show, we have a Heart Gallery video that talks about this child needs a home, and it's a video of that child. So this is a youth advisory board video, right? Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So you're over there, huh? Okay. Welcome to Doors to Hope and Healing, an inside look at foster care and adoption needs in Connecticut. My name is Jacqueline Ford. I have had the honor of working for the department for close to 30 years, and although I may be familiar with many of the topics I bring to you, I have invited experts in those fields to help dispel the myths and misconceptions that often act as barriers. Join us as we open our doors to an inside look at the Department of Children and Families. Jim, thank you so much for joining us here on Doors to Hope and Healing.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
As you know, the purpose of our show is to dispel those myths and misconceptions that may surround our agency, and also show viewers all the various facets that we offer through our department. So we have so many of our guests are employees of DCF and can talk about just what they're an expert in. And what we're going to talk about today is something that you know so much about, and I'm excited for you to share that with our viewers. Before we get started, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, my title is Program Supervisor for the DCF Licensing Unit. I've been with DCF coming up on 26 years now. Can't believe it's been that long.
It goes fast.
It goes fast. I started out as a social worker in the Willimantic office with in-home cases, then became an adolescent worker, and then in 1998 came to the licensing unit. At that point, we were called facility inspectors. Now that position is called regulatory consultants. And then in 2007, I became the supervisor of that unit. Prior to coming to DCF, though, I worked in the private sector for about a decade, mostly in children's residential programs, and then also in programs that serve adults who are homeless, and also in the mental health system. So I had a little bit of a priming to come into this kind of work from my private sector experience.
And in your private sector experience working in residential for children, what facility did you work for?
Well, I actually worked out of state. So I lived in California and Florida before coming to Connecticut.
And when you were in that role in the private sector, were you aware of the licensing regulations and as an employee there?
Not at all.
Yeah.
I had no idea that any of this even existed.
Until you became
the one to be doing it, right?
Yeah, which really will lead us great into our discussion, because I know that you have a group of dedicated staff that license facilities and all that we're going to speak about today to make sure that these facilities are reaching a high standard, a high quality of care for the children and families that they serve. So there are 4 categories of service that I understand the department is responsible for licensing. And what I'd like you to talk about is the child caring facilities, the child placing agencies, are extended day treatment and outpatient psych clinics for children. And I understand that they all have different requirements. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So let's start with the child care facilities. Can you explain what a child care facility is?
Sure. Simply put, a child caring facility is a home that provides 24-hour care for kids. By state law, a facility that does that has to have a license from DCF, or there are some exceptions. So Department of Developmental Services has group homes for their individuals. The State Department of Education has large boarding schools that they oversee. But for the most part, if you're going to operate a home that provides 24-hour care for kids, you have to have a license from DCF.
And are they considered DCF facilities?
No.
Okay.
So the quote-unquote DCF facilities would be the ones that we own and operate, we being the department. So those right now would be the two Solnit campuses, north and south, and we don't license those. By state statute, they're exempt, although that may change this legislative session, we'll see. But right now, the ones that we license are all private entities that apply to DCF to get a license.
So they apply and they say that, is it usually a group of people, or could it be one person that says, I'd like to open up a child caring facility and operate a 24-hour care facility for a child?
Well, they need to form a corporation. So they have to have a board of directors, they have to have bylaws. So we don't have single individuals that operate a home. We have some small operations, and then we have some very large corporations. But they do need to incorporate and have a governing structure.
And do they come to our department with this proposed plan, as with their governing structure, to care for children that are specific to DCF?
So that's a very important distinction. Our license covers any entity that wants to operate a child caring facility, whether it's funded by the state or not. So we do have about a third of our licenses are issued to completely private entities. They don't serve any DCF children at all. And then the bulk of them are agencies that we've contracted with over the years, and we fund directly.
So you could be licensing, you and your staff could be licensing a facility that doesn't even have any connection to a foster child being placed there.
That's correct.
But we have that mandate to license them.
Right.
So how is that different than, let's say, if one of our viewers is watching and they say, well, how is that different than a daycare? Is it because you're providing the 24-hour overnight care?
Yes, it's the 24-hour piece. And there's also the piece of serving children that are being in the custody of someone else. You're basically their custodian while they're with you, versus a daycare where the parent is coming and picking that child up every single day.
So this child's in the custody. Okay, so I think that really differentiates that and makes that understandable. So when we're talking about child care facilities, can you speak specifically to, I know that we refer to residential treatment facilities, residential education, temporary shelters, group homes, and safe homes. And safe homes, I don't believe that we're licensing any
those
longer.
have changed to what we call now SFIT programs.
Right.
So without getting too bogged down in all of the distinctions, I'll try to keep it as general as I can. So the residential treatment centers are focused mostly on trying to work with kids that have behavioral health issues. Usually they're shorter term in nature, and then ideally a child will return to their home, foster home, a family setting. The temporary shelters are just as they describe. Something's going on with a child, that their housing situation is in turmoil and they need a temporary stabilization period. And so they would go to one of our shelter programs. The group homes tend to be a little longer term. We have a number of therapeutic group homes that are designed to provide clinical services, as well as a more longer term housing situation. And then we also have, as you mentioned, the SFITs. They are very short term, 14-day stabilization and treatment, and kids then return home. Actually, one of the larger categories that we have in terms of the number of beds has to do with the residential education programs. And that's an interesting one because it is a boarding school model, but the school is a special education school. So there's a special ed program that is overseen by the State Department of Education, and then we license the boarding component.
Oh,
So these
okay.
would be kids who need a special education setting, but typically they live too far to be able to be a day student, and so then they'll board overnight and throughout the week.
Okay, and does our education department get involved with that?
No, it would be
School?
State Department of Education.
Of education. And then with the group homes, do you typically see that the group homes are a model for our adolescents that need a place to be and life skills and therapeutic mental health
So
services?
there are some subcategories under the group home heading. We have the therapeutic group homes, which are more clinical in their focus, and then we have what we call the SWETs. Without getting too much into the acronyms,
We have a lot of acronyms at DCF.
right, Supported Work Education and Training Program. That's what SWET stands for. Those are really to help kids who are going to be going into independent living gain those life skills. So it's a supported apartment program where there are
Before they-
staff on site, but kids can do their budgeting, their shopping, their cooking, transit, all those sorts of things in a more supported environment.
Which is such a great tool and useful service to be able to offer to our teens.
It really is. It's very needed for those
any
kids.
teen,
Yeah.
really for
Yeah.
any teen, but definitely our kids who are facing, the trauma and the challenges that they have.
Right.
So then now we talk about what is a child placing agency and what
Mm-hmm.
are those licensing requirements?
So child placing agencies are private foster and adoption agencies. So any private adoption in the state of Connecticut is done by one of the agencies that we license.
Okay.
And then on the foster care side, DCF has contracts for therapeutic foster care. And private agencies go out and recruit and approve homes in order to be therapeutic foster parents. And they have to have our license in order to do that.
Okay.
So our unit doesn't get involved in the licensing of any DCF foster homes or adoptive homes, but we license private agencies to essentially go out and license their own homes.
Okay, and it's a nice tie-in because in our last episode we had Nicole McKelvey who talked to us all about TFC,
Right.
therapeutic foster homes, and what our oversight is of that. So they can't do what we need them to do unless they become licensed
Right.
by us.
Right.
So what are the requirements? Can we touch upon the requirements to be able to be licensed?
So in general, all of our regulations touch on certain key areas. Like I mentioned with the board of directors, there's an administrative piece of it. So there need to be policies and procedures, a governing board. There has to be financial records so that we make sure an entity is solid financially. We don't want to issue a license to somebody that's going to go bankrupt in a few months.
Right.
So we want to make sure they're on solid ground financially. And then there's a whole host of things around the personnel. So the hiring, the training, background checks, all those things are incorporated. When we get into our more residential programs, there's a whole section on the physical environment. So we want to make sure that kids are living in clean, attractive, comfortable environments. And then there's always a section on case records. So every kid that's in care, the requirement is that a case record is produced and that there are certain components that have to be in that case record. And those things follow through all of our sets of regulations regardless of what kind of license it is.
Right, and I guess more specific to the various whatever the facility is that you're licensing, then it might be a different level of personnel and more specific to the need of that child
Exactly.
and that agency.
Exactly.
Okay, so there's also the extended day facilities. Can you explain what extended day means and the licensing process for that?
Sure. Probably the easiest way to explain it is that it's a clinical after-school program. So back in the 90s, DCF created these extended day treatment programs as a way of supporting kids in the community that needed more of a clinical setting after school. It's not quite at the level of, say, a partial hospital program. People may be familiar with that term. It's not designed to be quite that intensive, but still kids will get an hour of counseling, they'll get group work, there'll be some recreational activities. It's designed to support kids who are living in families either in the foster care system or even in their biological homes who need more support in that after-school period.
Okay. So they go right from school and they're transported to this facility
Yes,
to
typically.
get the services that they need.
Yep.
And then there are also additional supports for children in need, such as psychiatric clinics. Is that different than the extended day?
Yes. Yes and no. So there are some outpatient clinics that operate extended day treatment programs. So there is a mix there. And the regulations are very similar for the two. But the outpatient psychiatric clinics for children, that's a mouthful.
That's why we use acronyms.
Right, that's exactly why we use acronyms. That's a relatively new license, and it covers outpatient counseling centers. So this would be a place where anyone in the community could take their child to get outpatient counseling. They're required to provide a full spectrum of services, psychological testing, psychiatric evaluations, medication monitoring. Oftentimes they'll run groups. And we currently have almost as many outpatient clinics as we do group homes and other residential facilities. It's really a large sector for us. So they also incorporate a number of in-home services, fall under that license. So if a clinic is going into a family's home to deliver a particular kind of service, we have a whole alphabet soup of in-home models that are offered. That's also included in this license. And it's available to anyone. It doesn't have to be someone that is involved with DCF at all. We have a number of entities that have the license who are completely self-funding through private insurance and other payment forms.
And I think what's so important by having you on as our guest is, it shows what our investment is as an agency to families in our state that may not be seeking services directly from us. It's not that we're, an agency that is taking children away from their families and putting them in foster care and then offering them these services. We're overseeing the licensing of these facilities to ensure that standard of care that these children are getting, and they're not even involved in our agency. So I think that really sheds a great light on our department and how we are working with the community and our partners in these facilities to make sure that the families are served as best they can be.
Right. Well, DCF is the Children's Mental Health Agency for Connecticut.
Yes.
And the outpatient clinic license in particular is a good reflection of that, because those services are available to anyone in the community, whether or not they've ever come into contact with DCF.
Right. And I think that people fear that, that the only way that they can get a service like you're sharing, the mental health services, is if they have an open case with us.
Right.
And that's not true.
It's not true at all.
So I appreciate you being able to dispel that myth for our viewers. So are there a restriction in the number of specific agencies that you can license? I bet there's not a waiting list, but are there, if 100 agencies want to be considered extended day, can they be if they meet the requirements?
They could. One of the things that we always try to address right up front is the financial aspect of getting a license. As I mentioned before, we want programs to be solidly in good shape financially. So we will ask anyone that applies to us, so how are you going to fund this service? And we want some detail in terms of, we have these agreements with insurance companies, we've secured this grant from this government entity. So we want to see that they can actually fund this. And that's a restricting factor, because a lot of folks, I get calls all the time from people that from a very good place say, I want to open up a group home for kids. And when I start talking to them about some of the specifics of what it actually takes, you have to have the building, it has to pass fire and health codes, you have to hire staff, you have to have financial backing. It's a huge undertaking. We don't want people to come into this lightly.
Right.
So that kind of dynamic really, it does kind of limit the people that would be able to apply.
Sure. What about if they didn't meet all of those requirements and they were financially secure and they had the facility? Do you try not to have too many in the same region of DCF, or if that's the way? I know that it's a business as well. For many of these facilities, it's a business,
right.
and they're making a profit. So is there a competitive field so that there's not a lot in the same area, or does it really not matter?
From a legal standpoint, it doesn't really matter. We do have a fair number of companies from out of state that have come into Connecticut to set up a program, and they do that because they identify that Connecticut would be a good region for them. So they've done somewhat of a market analysis.
To see where they're needed.
They look at the need, they look at what other programs are in that part of the state. So for the most part, they do somewhat look at they limit themselves by looking at, am I going to be overburdening this community if I put up another program here?
Right. Right, and not being able to do the service that
And not
they're
being able to do the
intending.
service, right.
And so the next question I had for you is about the barriers, but I think you've covered the barriers well. And there's expectations that each service has that they have to meet, and those barriers could be the space and the finances, and not having really that corporation set up as a governing body to do that. Is there anything else that I may have missed or about barriers in licensing?
Well, people often ask, how long is this going to take?
Yeah, that was my next question.
Well,
How
okay.
long is the process?
And that's a very logical question to ask. And my response to them is, it really depends on how well prepared you are. So our process is fairly transparent. We have an online application system. We have policies and a practice guide that I send to people. We have a number of checklists that we use when we go out and do our visits. So we lay it out to people and saying, these are all the things that need to be accomplished. Now it's up to you. Once those things are in place, our process is pretty straightforward. We'll review the documents, we'll schedule a time to go out and visit the site, we'll verify that certain things are in place. I mean, really, we can get a license issued within a couple of weeks if someone is really well prepared. But it's all those little details that have to be in place first that can drag things out.
Right. And if you're doing a license of a facility that another agency is also licensing, do you need to work collaboratively with them, or do we just do our piece and then step out?
So over the years, we've worked really hard with other state agencies to not duplicate licenses. So as it stands right now, we don't have any facilities that have duplicate licenses. What we do have is the facility, if it's a residential facility, for example, they'll have to get local approvals through their health inspection, the health department, the fire marshal, that sort of thing. And we try to collaborate with those folks to make sure that we understand what their concerns are. But a number of years ago, we did have some facilities that had 2 licenses, sometimes 3 licenses, and we've tried to eliminate that duplication.
Right, for them and paperwork reduction too,
Absolutely, right. And confusing to have too many standards at once.
It is, and we need to be talking better. I so appreciate you being on. We're at the close of our show. If any of our viewers are watching and they are interested in becoming licensed for any of the facilities that we discussed now, how would they find you?
So the easiest way to find us would be to go on the DCF website, and in the search bar, just type in licensing, and we will be the first entry that comes up. And we do have a dedicated web page just to our licensing function, and my contact information is there.
And does that also talk about some of the steps and the regulations that they need?
It has our practice guide. It'll walk you through all the things that need to be in place.
Perfect. Well, that's a great start. Thank you for being on.
My pleasure.
Our
Thank you for inviting me.
viewers are now going to see a video that was created by our youth as a message for the community. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Being in foster care has helped me become more independent.
Foster parents can offer youth a practical opportunity to learn by teaching them how to cook, how to do your laundry, separate the whites from the colors, and, or even how to set up a bank account.
My foster mother, on top of helping me emotionally, also helped me practically.
A lot of kids in foster care do need someone to fill that parental role.
She helped me to understand money, and whenever I'd spend money too fast, she'd be like, there goes, you got that hole in your pocket, huh?
Just something as simple as, credit, filing taxes, trying to buy a car, insurance, things like that, or buying appliances, or even grocery shopping and budgeting, opening accounts.
Some of the things foster parents can teach youth is to cook, is to talk. Maybe they'll help them learn talents they didn't know they can do.
It's day-to-day stuff. Bringing someone to the grocery store, bringing them to the bank with you. Like doing simple stuff like that. Going to get your oil changed. Teaching them what happens when your car breaks down.
Helping them get their driver's license, working with work-to-learn programs. Just being a parent, the same as you would with your biological children.
They can help us learn how to pay taxes, maybe give us some job opportunities and learn how to make our own money. Even putting money in the bank can help for the future.
And it's those everyday experiences that's what's gonna give a person life skills. And you're only gonna get that by being in a home environment.